Alright, welcome back to part 2 of building a guitar out of pallets. In part 1, I broke down about 30 pallets, milled everything, and glued them into different patterns for the neck, top, and back blanks. And in this video, we're actually going to start turning those into a guitar. So stick around because this is where the fun begins. To start off this video, I'm going to begin with the purfling. I started with these 3 boards. I thought they were all poplar at first, which is why I chose them, but spoiler alert, one is not like the other. From there, I took them to the joiner to get one flat face and one straight edge. After that, I brought them down to thickness on the table saw, trying to keep them as thick as possible while still maintaining 3 clean sides. Then, using the crosscut sled, I cut them to length. Okay, so now that I have these 3 boards square on 3 sides, now I kind of just need to figure out exactly how I'm going to cut each one to try to yield as much material as possible while avoiding all these nail holes. This one I'll probably do I'll get kind of a chunk here, chunk there, this one right down the middle, and then this one I'll probably get one here and then a short one there, and that's about it. That's all I'm probably gonna get out of these 3. Alright. Once I had 3 clean sides on each board, I went ahead and started cutting as many strips as I could from them. Well, actually, let me back up. I ended up only using this one board. The other 2 were definitely poplar, but this 3rd one, I'm not really sure what it is. I went ahead and used it anyway because I was able to get enough purfling out of it, and I really liked how close it looked to maple, even though I know it's not. Once I had all the strips cut, I ran them through the planer and brought them down to their final thickness, which is about 3/16 of an inch. And this is where I realized I messed up. What I should have done was run the whole board through the planer so I had all 4 sides clean. That way I could have taped everything back together and cut all the strips at once, instead of cutting each one individually like this. It still worked in the end though. What I did was cut each strip at about 1/16 of an inch, then moved the fence over and cut the next one. Again, about 1/16 of an inch. After that, I ran every strip through the drum sander to about 20 thousandths of an inch. This is where taping them together would have helped a lot because I would have had more consistent thickness and a cleaner result overall. But I just wasn't quite thinking ahead on that one. Now to dye the black purfling, I went with the tea and iron oxide method. I started by boiling a gallon of water and adding about 100 tea bags. And yes, curiosity got the best of me. I did taste it. It was very bitter. After that, I let the strips soak in the tea bath. Here I am pulling them all out, and I actually saved the tea so I could reuse it for a second soak later. And for the bath, I just used a piece of PVC pipe with caps on both ends, glued together to hold the liquid. From there, I moved on to the iron oxide. All I did was take a bucket, add some steel wool and vinegar, and let the steel wool break down. Ideally, you want to let this sit for about a week so the vinegar can fully dissolve the steel wool. Then I dropped the strips into the iron oxide, using a few blocks to keep everything from floating. When you first pull them out, they're not fully black, but as they dry, they get darker and darker, which is pretty cool to see. Now this is where I messed up. I only let the strips soak in the tea for about an hour and didn't give the iron oxide enough time either. The outside looked great, but the color didn't penetrate all the way to the core. So I went back and redid the process properly, letting the strips soak in the tea for a couple of days, then went back into the iron oxide for a few more days to get full penetration. If you try this, I'd recommend letting everything sit for several days. Honestly, closer to a week if you have the time. The nice thing with this method is you can repeat the process as much as needed to get the look you want. Basically what's happening is the tea adds tannins to the wood, giving it an orange tone. Then the iron oxide reacts with those tannins and ebonizes the wood, turning it jet black. Moving on to the back inlay, I wanted to make the purfling first because I needed it for the back inlay. For the design, I kept it simple. I drew this shape on Adobe Photoshop and printed out a few copies so everything would stay consistent. Nothing too fancy or really all that original, but it will add a nice bit of elegance to the back. This is the wood I chose for the inlay. This piece had a few nails I had to remove, but it also had some really nice spalting going on, so I tried to preserve as much of that as possible. To add the inlay design, I just used a glue stick and attached the printed template directly to the wood, then cut it out on the bandsaw. After that, I used a disc sander and spindle sander to get as close to the line as possible. Then I went back with a file and a sanding stick to smooth everything out and make the shapes as uniform as I could. Something to consider when making an inlay is the thickness of the material you're working with. If it's too thick, it makes it a lot harder to keep the edges square, and if they ain't square, you'll have a bad time getting them in the hole. Too thin and you risk sanding it off or breaking it because it's too brittle. I generally go about 75 thousandths of an inch, but it really depends on the material and the shape of the inlay. Once all the pieces were cut, I added the back purfling around the borders of each one. I cut the strips slightly over length, glued them onto the pieces, and then used a combination of files and sanding to dial in the miters. Normally you'd use a chisel to cut clean miters, but the purfling I used was really brittle, and my chisel probably wasn't quite sharp enough, so it kept causing issues. That's why I went with the less traditional method of using files and sandpaper to get everything to fit. After that, I taped the inlay to the back of the guitar and carefully marked it with an X-Acto knife. The tape worked, but for the other two pieces, I used a small amount of super glue instead, which actually held a lot better. Then I used a Dremel and took multiple shallow passes, gradually working deeper and closer to the edge each time. Once I removed most of the material with the downcut spiral bit, I switched to a small diamond sanding bit to get as close to the lines as possible. This kind of bit is nice because it removes material slowly and lets me have a lot more accuracy. From there, I used a micro chisel to clean everything up, working right to that knife line to remove the remaining material. Once I had a good fit, I gently tapped the inlay into place. Instead of gluing it beforehand, I wicked in the CA glue in afterwards to lock it in. I also sanded it slightly to help fill in any small gaps. I did it this way just to avoid the risk of the glue setting before I could get the piece fully seated, which could have thrown off the fit. Then I repeated the same process for the other two pieces. Next, since this is a semi-hollow body guitar, I needed to route out the wing cavities. I started by making a template out of hardboard. I drew a center line, traced the overall body shape, and then laid out what I'm just going to call a box down the middle. Or maybe I should call it the island. No, I'll just call it a box. Now I sized that box to account for the width of the pickups, and then made it as short as possible while still leaving enough room for the bridge and tailpiece. To create the inside wall shape, I measured about 1/4 of an inch from the outer edge, about 1,000 times, and then used the original template to connect everything and trace the final shape. Now to route this out, I did make a rough template for the center island box thing, that way I would have clean straight edges. For the sides though, I didn't have a template to follow, so I ended up freehanding that part. It was pretty rough and took a while, but I got there in the end. Afterward, I went back and sanded everything smooth to clean it up. Once that was done, I took both templates and drilled a hole through the center, where the neck pocket would be. That gave me a reference point I could use as a locator pin. Then, with the template positioned exactly where I wanted it, I drilled a matching hole in the body so I could line everything up accurately moving forward. Before routing out the wing cavities, I needed to route the wire channels that connect the control cavity, pickups, and the switch. This part was pretty simple. I didn't even have to make a template, which was a blessing at this point. I just clamped a straight edge to the body and used that as a guide. Then I made several passes with the router, gradually bringing it down to depth and making sure everything would connect properly, including the pickups. Next, I needed to remove as much material as possible from the wing cavities using a Forstner bit. I worked my way around the layout, making sure I stayed within my lines and set a depth stop so I wouldn't go too deep. I just wanted to get close enough to that the router wouldn't have to do all the heavy lifting and I could maintain some sort of sanity. Once I had most of the material cleared out, I used the locator pins to realign everything and put the template back in place. From there, I went back in with the router and started cleaning up the wing cavities. This was a pretty long process still. It took several hours just taking small passes and removing as little material as possible each time so I wouldn't burn out the bit, or worse, have a catastrophic failure. Eventually, I did start getting some burn marks and I had to replace the router bit. After that, I kept working my way around until I was deep enough to remove the template and finish the cavities using the previous passes as a guide. Now, this centerpiece here was mainly there to support the template structurally. It's not actually part of the final guitar, so I went ahead and routed it off. For this, I didn't use a template either. I just freehanded it and carefully moved it like so. Next, I needed to cut the outer shapes of the body using the bandsaw. I worked my way around the outline, but I couldn't cut as close as I would have liked because the blade is pretty dull and a little sketchy. So I just took it slow, cutting in small sections and making sure I didn't bog down the blade. And I didn't film it, but I repeated the same process on the top bead as well. Now, it was time to glue everything together. I wanted to make sure the wire channels didn't get filled with glue since the wiring still needs to pass through freely. So I just used a little bit of tape and taped over those openings just to keep them protected. Then I applied glue around the perimeter and on the center island box, spreading it out as evenly as I could. For the edges, I used my finger to kind of wipe away some of the glue away from the inner edge so it wouldn't get too much squeeze out on the inside of the cavities. The goal was just to keep the inside as clean as possible. Then right before assembly, I removed the tape and used the locator pins to line everything up. This part was pretty stressful because it didn't want to go together at first and my drill bits pins just decided they didn't want to go in the holes anymore. So I ended up switching to wood dowels in a pinch, and if I didn't have those just randomly sitting there, I would have been screwed. Once everything was aligned, I used parallel clamps all the way around and then long cam clamps across the center to apply even pressure. Then, it was time to route out the final shape. Same process as before, I taped the template in place and slowly routed it out, taking as many light passes as possible. I could have done this on the router table, and I probably would have gotten a slightly cleaner result, but I decided not to. If a router catches on a handheld pass, you can pull away sometimes with minimal damage rather than having your guitar launched across the room with the router table. On my last electric guitar build, I actually did it on the router table, and when it caught, it chewed up the workpiece pretty badly. I ended up spending a lot of time trying to repair it, and I didn't want to repeat that here. So, I went with a slightly sketchier but safer in my mind method of a handheld router, taking multiple shallow passes to remove the material, and in the end, it came out pretty clean. There are a few small marks, but they'll buff out. Next, I needed to make the mortise and tenon templates. I started by cutting a piece of hardboard to the exact size of the tenon. Then I taped the second piece on top creating a sort of a sandwich, and used that assembly as a template for routing. Then using the router table this time, I followed that template to cut out the tenon shape. Once I had the tenon, I used it as a reference to trace out the mortise. From there, I taped scrap pieces along the layout lines to build up a guide. Cut it out on the bandsaw, and then clean it up with a handheld router to get the final shape. And that gave me a matching mortise and tenon. Now for the mortise, the template I made earlier wasn't exactly used to route the mortise itself. It was mainly to help build a mortise jig. For the jig, I cut 3 boards, with 2 of them matching so they could act as the legs. I taped those 2 together so I could cut the angle at the same time and keep everything perfectly consistent. To figure out that angle, I used an online triangle calculator to get the exact measurements I needed. That gave me a sort of odd-shaped rectangle, but more importantly, it created a 3-degree incline for the mortise. And that 3-degree angle leans the neck back just enough so the strings sit at the right height above the body and the bridge. Then using my joiner sled, I taped the piece down with the edge aligned to that line and carefully made the cut on the table saw. Then using some super glue, I attached the 2 legs to the 3rd piece, which acts as the top of the mortise jig. I also labeled everything beforehand to make sure it all went together in the correct orientation. After applying a bit of pressure, I double-checked that everything was perfectly square. This part is pretty delicate so taking your time is pretty important. Then I hit it with some accelerator to lock it in place and repeated the process on the other side. Once everything was glued up, I reinforced it with a few screws. From there, I drew a center line and used the mortise template to line everything up so it matched the edge. Then I cut out the bulk of material on the bandsaw. After that, I used a router to clean up and bring the mortise to its final shape. Then using the mortise template, I traced out where the mortise will go on the body. After that, I used the Forstner bit to remove as much material as possible without going too deep, just to clear out most of the waste before routing. From there, I used a series of router bits in different lengths, starting with the smallest one and gradually working up. This let me remove material in stages and avoid any catching or tear out. Funny story, on the first electric guitar I ever made, I tried to remove way too much material at once in the neck pocket. The router cut and nearly ripped out of my hands. It was pretty scary, especially with a 2.5-inch bit spinning. It actually carved the top of the guitar like a turkey. Luckily, I was able to fix it afterward and hide the repairs with paint, but it definitely taught me that routers are scary and not to be messed with. Next, I needed to make the pickup cavities. And the pickup cavity shape is basically 2 rectangles nested inside each other. So I drew that out on a piece of hardboard. I started with the long, narrow rectangle first. I taped scrap particle board along the edges to act as a temporary routing guide and used that as my template. I made sure everything stayed square and kept consistent spacing all the way through. Once the long cavity was routed, I repeated the same process for the wider, shorter rectangle. Together, that gave me the full pickup cavity shape, like so. Then, using that as a reference, I cut out a piece of particle board and that would become the actual routing jig for the pickups. One at a time, I routed each pickup cavity into it, making sure everything stayed accurate in both position and spacing. The goal here was to lock the exact placement, not just between the pickups, but also relative to the neck joint and to the edge of the guitar. By building one master template, I can now reuse it on future guitars without remeasuring everything from scratch. And if I ever mess up, I can just remake the template instead of the whole body. That's the neck pickup cavity, and then here's the bridge pickup cavity. I always like to run my fingers through the cavities at this stage because you can feel imperfections a lot better than your eyes can see them. After checking everything, it was spot on, square, properly spaced and aligned exactly where it needed to be. Then I cut out the shape of the guitar into that template so I could use it to line everything up with the body edges and lock in the correct position. After that, I routed out each pickup cavity one at a time. There are actually two different depths involved here. First, I routed the entire cavity to its final depth of about 65 thousandths of an inch. Then on the two ends, I went in deeper, about 1.25 inches, to make room for the pickup height adjusting screws. To do that, I positioned the router at the edge, brought it up to speed, lowered it to its final depth, and then carefully moved it forward before shutting it off and lifting it out. This part is pretty sketchy. You really can't tilt the router at all or it'll catch and destroy the entire world. Unfortunately, the bridge pickup kind of landed right in the center of the circle, which isn't where I wanted it. In my mind, I always pictured it to be more here, but of course, I never actually thought about it until now. But then I looked back and I realized I was kind of doomed from the start because in order for the circle to be more here, I needed more material down here. But the boards for the top of the blank were never long enough to achieve this. And I'm not entirely sure why I did that. At that point, I was able to start breaking down pallets pretty quickly. I also didn't really need long boards for this build, so I wasn't too worried about maximizing every single piece of material. I mostly just needed volume, not length. Anyways, next I needed to cut out the switch cavity. This part was pretty straightforward. I started by marking the location with a single center point, then using a small drill bit that was long enough, I drilled all the way through to establish a reference hole on the backside. From there, I used a 2 1/8 inch Forstner bit to carefully drill out the recess for the switch plate. I went to about 100 thousandths of an inch deep, just enough for the plate to sit flush. Then using the center point from the brad point, I drilled out the full access hole for the switch using a smaller Forstner bit. Now the control cavity was a little more involved. I started by measuring the spacing between each potentiometer and transferred that layout onto a piece of hardboard. Then using a 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit, I drilled 4 holes at each control location. From there, I used a compass to set the same radius to draw connecting curves between the 4 circles, forming the overall cavity shape. After laying that out, I routed it out by hand, getting as close to the lines as possible. Then I refined the shape further on the spindle sander and finished it off by hand to smooth everything out. That gave me the template I can then use to add to my pickup routing jig. And since those holes were drilled by the Forstner bit, I could use the same bit to locate the template accurately on the jig and route it out like so. Then just checked with my fingers for any imperfections. Now on the top of the guitar, I used the jig to locate the 4 holes for the potentiometers using the force bit. I dropped it into each of those pockets to mark the exact positions. I only drilled pilot holes at this point since I still need to shape the body later and larger holes would just get in my way. After that, I put the jig on the back of the guitar and routed out the main control cavity. That gave me the full internal cutout. Next, I needed to create the recess where the control cavity cover will sit. I followed the same general process, but this time used a 2-inch Forstner bit to establish the layout around each potentiometer location. Then I used scrap wood as guides, lining them up with the edges of those circles to form a more square shape or parallelogram. Once I had enough depth, I used that as a reference to finish the routing passes. Then I routed out the shape on the guitar. I kept the depth at about 100 thousandths of an inch to match the switch cavity, and made sure it was placed even and symmetrical around the previous cutout. After a final check for any imperfections with my fingies, there you go, one control cavity. Alright, that's it for this one. Body's mostly there, but in the next one I will be shaping the profile of the body plus adding the binding, which will really show the true pattern of the sun design that I got going on here. If you want to see where this pallet wood build goes, make sure you're subscribed. I'll see you next time. Thanks.